The 22nd of January 1879, one of the most well-known dates in British military history. It saw the crushing Zulu victory at Isandlwana.
The saluting fellow braves.
And the brave defiant stand by the Redcoats at Rorke's Drift. But did you know there was another battle fought that same day, not too far away, here on the other side of Zululand? And that's what we're discussing today, the Battle of Nyezane, Britain's forgotten Zulu war battle. Also fought on the 22nd, and today we'll be walking the ground and visiting the graves of the brave men killed in action. It's a fascinating battle that saw the British deploy the Gatling gun on land for the first time. Stay tuned to find out how that went, and why things turned out very differently from events just 70 miles away. When the British invaded Zululand, they did it with 3 advancing columns. Today we're looking at the actions of the coastal column, aka number 1 column or the right flank column.
So where I'm stood now is what used to be known as Fort Pearson. It was right on the border. This is the Tugela River down below me, and this was the jumping off point for the invasion.
The fort was named after the column's commander, Colonel Charles Pearson of the Buffs, and consisted of around 4,000 soldiers, including 1,000 regular army redcoats from the 3rd and 99th regiments. As it says on one of these boards, Fort Pearson was built on this knoll overlooking the Tugela River. It was built in January 1879 by Marines from the ship HMS Active and named after Colonel Charles Knight Pearson, commander of the right flank column. So around the fort is what remains, or what appears to be the remains of the old earthworks. There's not too much to see, but with a little bit of imagination, you can start to think what it must have been like. Now, I'm sorry to say that like many old historical sites across South Africa, especially from the colonial era, they are starting to fall apart. This is the inside of Fort Pearson now. There is some information, but as you can see, it's not being well maintained.
So interestingly, if you take the walkway over the highway from Fort Pearson, is this spot. This is the ultimatum tree. And this was the place where in December 1878, there was a meeting with the Zulu chiefs. And it was here that the British gave them a series of ultimatums that they had to fulfill. When the Zulus were incapable of fulfilling those, that's what led to the outbreak of war. And this spot can still be visited, though it is somewhat remote. I'd probably not recommend coming on your own.
Their advance across this river had been severely delayed by bad weather, which had damaged the ponts and meant men and supplies hadn't arrived on time. They finally got across it on the 12th and began their advance along the narrow track towards the Norwegian mission station at a place called Eshowe. The road was thick with mud and hard going. Colonel Pearson's force was soon strung out and stretched for miles. It was a very precarious situation. Unlike the other column commanders in Zululand, it seems Pearson was not scared of the Zulus. He didn't take them as seriously as he should.
So you can hear there's still a road that runs through the battlefield of Nyezane. And on the morning of the 22nd, after crossing the Nyezane River, they got to about this point.
But concealed nearby was a powerful Zulu impi of over 6,000 warriors under the command of Chief Godide Kandlela. Unbeknown to Pearson, an attack was now imminent. At the forefront of the British advance was this dashing young officer, Captain Fitzroy Hart. He was a special service officer attached to the 2nd Regiment of the Natal Native Contingent. They were the locally recruited black Zulu troops fighting alongside the British. He's left us this account of what happened next, as his men, lightly armed and scouting ahead of the main body, began to advance past this hill, Wambane Hill, aka Magia's Hill. He said, "Suddenly a mass of Zulus appeared on the hilltop on our left and opened a fire of musketry upon us at a distance of about 400 yards. I saw at once that we had almost fallen into a trap, and I instantly gave the order to retire. At the same moment the Zulus poured down the hill by hundreds at the top of their speed with a tremendous shout, while others above kept up the fire over our heads as they descended the hill. The kloof was not far behind us, and we reached it as far as I could perceive without any loss, although the bullets whistled amongst us and struck the earth all about us as we went. Hart and his men had encountered the Zulu left horn." Now, if you know about Zulu tactics, you know their favourite tactic was one known as the horns of the buffalo. They had a left horn, a right horn and a chest. and the goal was to completely envelop you and wipe you out.
First, the head moves forward, and the enemy naturally moves in to meet it. But it's only a feint. The warriors in the head then disperse to form the encircling horns, and the enemy is drawn in on the loins. And the horns close in on the back and sides. Finish.
To escape, Hart had to take a dangerous detour in order to steer his horse around a deep ravine.
To Hart's horror, he watched as his NCOs withdrew through the ravine. What they didn't realise is that the Zulus were hiding inside and casualties were heavy.
It must have been a terrifying moment. Seeing the fight develop, Colonel Pearson quickly deployed the advanced elements of his column, mainly consisting of 2 companies of the Buffs and the men of the Royal Engineers. The artillery was also quickly called into action, 2 7-pounders, their thunderous booms shaking the ground all around. G. Baskerville, one of the engineers who'd been busy at the river, now takes up the story. No sooner was the firing heard and then we threw our picks and shovels down and dashed across the river and around to the right into the thick dense bush, about 800 yards away. We then soon came into action. We poured in a deadly volley into the thick mass of the enemy, which made them sit up a bit. We then extended out into skirmishing order and kept up a well-sustained fire on the enemy, who did not show any want of pluck, for on several occasions they came as close as 50 yards of the muzzles of our rifles. But these individuals paid for their audacity with their lives. We then advanced on them, but they got around on our right flank and partly in our rear, so we got the order to retire. No sooner did they see us retiring when they set up a deafening yell and rushed out of the bush, but we turned around on them and put another volley into them which checked them for a time. We then had 2 ranks reversed, one rank one way and the rear rank the other, and we then did a bit of fighting back to back. After about 15 minutes in that position they turned and fled, for the firing was too hot for them. Phew, that must have been a very nerve-wracking moment for the Redcoats. Those Royal Engineers fighting back to back like that brings to mind the 28th Regiment of Foot, later the Gloucesters, at Alexandria in 1801.
So with the attack of the left horn over Wombane Hill blunted, the chest now came into action along this road that you can probably just see behind me.
The Zulu warriors took up a firing position in a kraal and used their muskets and rifles to take pot shots at the British soldiers. But as we were to see time and time again in this war, the Zulus were generally poor marksmen who didn't use their sights correctly and often shot high. Taking advantage of this, a scratch force under Hart again advanced along the road, pushed the Zulus out of the kraal and set fire to it. And it was now that the Gatling gun made its introduction. The Gatling is a fascinating weapon, a multi-barreled hand-cranked firearm that could fire hundreds of rounds a minute. Now, my understanding is that the gun had been deployed with the British force during the Second Ashanti War a few years earlier, but hadn't actually been used in action. Now it was time to put it to the test. If I'm wrong about that, let me know in the comments. The Gatling was under the command of 19-year-old naval midshipman Lewis Coker, because there was a naval brigade with the British force. Despite severe difficulties, he and his men dragged it from the wagons and placed it on a small knoll. 300 rounds whipped from its barrels in a minute before, true to form, it jammed. But it had done its job and broken the morale of the Zulu centre. On Pearson's left flank, the Zulu right horn was now deploying, but they lacked the conviction, and the attack was broken by just a handful of colonial volunteers and a few rounds from the 7-pounder guns. Despite the British being strung out along the road and outnumbered, they were now clearly getting the upper hand. Hart, who seems to have been all over this battle, then led an assault to force the Zulu left off Wombane Hill. He wrote, "The summit of the hill was now before me, about 200 yards off, and the enemy, though still firing upon us from it, were now reduced to a small group who held their ground. My little party plodded steadily on. They were now but half a dozen white men, and so perseveringly had they clambered up the steep ascent that the Buffs and the Naval Brigade were now at least 50 yards behind us. 200 yards more and the position would be ours. I urged my men to their utmost speed and charged forward on horseback at the group of Zulus on the summit. They all fled except one man. He stood leaning forward, watching me intently, his left hand on his knee and his rifle ready in his right. I could see glistening on his head the black ring that signifies in Zululand a married man. I was rapidly approaching him. He was now only 100 yards distant, and in a few moments I should use my revolver. But just then he dropped quickly on one knee, took very deliberate aim at me for a couple of seconds and fired. He seemed scarcely to believe he could have missed his prize, for he waited to take one eager look at me as the smoke cleared away, and then, seeing me still coming, he bolted away and disappeared directly afterwards as I was on the summit and saw hundreds of Zulus crowding down the opposite side of the hill in full retreat. By the way guys, I just want to quickly interrupt before we wrap up to say in a few weeks I'm going to the battlefields of the Peninsular War. Yeah, I'm travelling to Spain and Portugal for a week with my good friend and friend of the show, Marcus Cribb. We're going to be walking the ground at loads of places including Talavera, Salamanca, Fuentes de Oñoro, Ciudad Rodrigo. I'm hoping it'll be really fun and will make for great videos. Now, as you can imagine, a trip like that's bloody expensive. So if anyone's able to help, I am offering in exchange for, say, let's say a $20 donation or more if you're feeling particularly generous, you'll get a name check on one of the videos so we can mention you by name in one of the videos and say thanks. If that sounds like your cup of tea, if you're interested, then you can make that donation over at ko-fi.com/redcoathistory. That's ko-fi.com/redcoathistory.
And so the battle was over. It was just 9:30 in the morning. The British patched up their wounded, including the Zulu wounded, who they then took prisoner. Remember, this was the early days of the war, before the British realised that the Zulus didn't take prisoners. After Isandlwana, there was to be no more such gentlemanly behaviour. Now this is the memorial on the site of the old battlefield. It's quite hard to find actually, so make sure you put it into your sat-nav, because if you're looking for signs on the R66 there, you won't see them.
Here it says, in memory of the following officers and men killed on the 22nd of January 1879 at the Battle of Nyezane. 8 who are buried here, I think that says. It's hard to make out the names now, it's a little bit worn. But at the bottom you can read 5 privates of the Natal Native Corps.
About 12 men were killed and around 20 injured. Okay, I'm pleased to see that nearby is this memorial stone to the Zulu soldiers who were killed. It says about 300 warriors representing these regiments lost their lives, perished here fighting the invader. My words, not theirs. It says here the regiments included the Izingulube, Inkwa, Unhapo, Izingwegwe, Insukamgeni. I think that's right. I'm sure someone will tell me if I'm wrong. The battle is almost forgotten now, overshadowed of course by that famous battle at Isandlwana about 70 miles away. So what was so different here? Why did the British emerge victorious?
Well, for a start, this wasn't the main Zulu impi. There were elements from some senior regiments that had been sent from Ondini, the Zulu capital, but the rest were local men who perhaps lacked some of the fighting spirit and training. Wombane Hill, aka Magia's Hill, was a great spot for an ambush, but the Zulus were interrupted and the left horn forced to deploy too soon. This upset the entire plan. Like Colonel Pulain at Isandlwana, Colonel Pearson also deployed his men in skirmishing order. But he wasn't punished for it, he got away with it. The Zulu army was much smaller than the one at Isandlwana, and the men not as well trained and perhaps not as dedicated. They were never able to get close enough to use their assegais. Also, for the classic Zulu horns of the buffalo tactic to work, all the parts need to be coordinated and to strike at the right moment. Their commander, Chief Godide, found that impossible with his force that included so many irregulars. By the time the right horn came into action, the left horn and centre were already stalled and in trouble. The men of the right, lacking the usual zeal and determination that we saw at other battles in the war, quickly dissolved and fell back. With hindsight, even Lord Chelmsford, General Officer commanding in South Africa, later told Pearson that he'd been lucky and that next time he must deploy his men in close order. Pearson's force after the battle continued their advance to the mission station at Eshowe. But once news of Isandlwana reached them, they dug in and were besieged. Now I'm going to be covering that forgotten siege in a future video that will also include drone footage of the defences that can still be seen, as well as the cemetery. Anyway, in the meantime, to learn more about the Zulu War, then subscribe and watch this video on screen now to really understand what happened at the Battle of Isandlwana. I'll see you next week.